1997 reunion. It is August 28th, 1997, and we are here with Robert Bisson? Roger, excuse me, Roger
Yeah.
Bisson.
Mhm.
Why don't you, oh, my name is Michelle Colvin, and why don't we get started?
Okay.
Where and when were you born?
I was born in Indian Orchard, Massachusetts. And when? January 7th, 1923. So, yeah, I'm still kicking.
What was it like growing up?
What was it like growing up?
Do you remember
Well,
activities? What?
I had the, I don't know whether it's pleasure, but I had, my mother was sick a good part of the time, and so we wound up living in different places with different members of the family and going to school at different places. I started in West Springfield, Mass, and then wound up having to go to live with an uncle and aunt for a couple of years when things were pretty bad, and I went to school there in Indian Orchard, where I was originally born, and then left there to go back to West Springfield, Mass, where I finished high school. And then started going to college, and then some things sort of got in the way, like
Things?
invitation from
Yeah.
Uncle Sam, and no, that's not true. I never did receive an invitation. I volunteered before I was old enough to be drafted, and so I went off to learn what life was all about from West Springfield, Mass.
You say we when we moved around from place to place. Was that with your parents, or was it?
Well,
just your siblings?
it was mostly the kids having to live with somebody else when my mother was sick, and so it just posed some problems. I must say that I had 2 wonderful years with this uncle and aunt. Great 2 years, because she didn't speak any English. She only spoke French. And she scarcely ever went out of the house. And she used to dote on me and then any kid that came along after me. So it was a real nice experience. Living there, I was sort of the king of the roost, you might say, and there wasn't anything they wouldn't do for me at the time.
How many siblings did you have?
I had 3, and they're all dead.
And you were the oldest, or
I was the eldest, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I had two brothers and a sister, and all have preceded me. And I very nearly went there a little earlier this year to join them. I had second bypass surgery done, and some complications arose, but I'm here.
Well, you look good, and we're glad to have you.
Thank you.
What did your father do for a living?
My father was a machinist for Gilbert and Barker company right there in West Springfield. In fact, we lived down the street from the plants. It was a matter of just walking to work and back. And so we spent a good part of our life there in West Springfield. And he then went on to California and wound up doing an awful lot of consulting work. He evidently was quite skilled in machinery, and So he was always going off someplace to solve somebody's problem somewhere. And yeah, my mother died when I was 10, and really an unusual person, and a delight, pure delight. Then, of course, I had a brother who was 2 years younger than I was. And then there was an 8-year gap between him and the next one. Our sister was the third one, and then less than a year after that, another boy was born, and so she really should not have been pregnant. So that's pretty much all I have to say about then.
Well, it's good that you still have fond memories of your mother.
Oh yeah. She was top notch. Yeah, very good, very good. Just too bad that she had a heart condition as well, and she never could get over it. But in the meantime, two of us went off to live at a school in Worcester, Mass, boarding school, and we spent 2 years there. And then we went up to Canada, of all things, and to another school, and we spent 2 years there. And then we came back to the United States, and I went into high school and finished there in West Springfield.
So were you good at making friends without moving, or did you just kind of keep your distance?
No, we seemed to get along okay. Perhaps my brother was more easy to get along with than I was, but nonetheless, I met a few good people that I really enjoyed knowing and being with, and I sort of focused on them rather than a whole lot of other people. And that's pretty much continued throughout life as far as I'm concerned.
You said that you did start college?
Yes, I started in Springfield at Northeastern University. They had a branch there from Boston branch, the Springfield branch, and I started school there until I was still too young to be invited to participate, but my father had to sign the release for me at 18 to go in. But at that point, I was determined that I was going to go, and because it was something totally different, and yet I felt that I wanted to participate.
And what year was that?
That was in, Lordy, that was in 42, yeah. And from there I went for basic training in Virginia. And from there I went to different places with different units, and finally transferred to the 12th 2 weeks before we left Fort Camp Barkley, not the other one, Camp Barkley, Texas. And so it was a matter of getting to know all the men in the unit that I was going to be serving with. And fortunately, I had a sergeant who just died this year, as a matter of fact. He died just, about a month and a half ago. And he'd been with the unit all along, and so it was mostly a matter of my being told about things, and then he would go out and do it, which he was going to do whether I was there or not. So.
Who was that?
Wesley Gardner, Gardiner, and he had served in. He was 20 years older than I was, and he had served in the Army back in the big one, World War I, briefly, and he was from Long Island, and he had his own business, and he shut it all down and he too had to volunteer because he was too old to be drafted, and he had to persuade people in Washington whom he knew to get him in. And finally he made it, and he joined the 12th. Started out probably for infantry, but then somebody decided that there was a good man to get, and persuaded them to join the medics, and so he was there for essentially 3 years before I got there. So that's there were a number of other people, but he stands out as a remarkable individual. And of course, it made it very easy for me because I didn't have to do much if I didn't want to. But he never once ever let that influence his conduct. He was always respectful and never once felt that he could cross over the border if he wanted to. But it was pure delight. So when we came back to the United States after the war was over, why, we continued our friendship all this time, and would frequently not meet one another for several years, but we were always in contact with one another at one time or another, and so it was a delight knowing him, and his experience was totally different than mine was, but so it was nice seeing that part of life.
You said you started your boot camp basic training in West Virginia?
No, actually it started in Virginia.
Right, Virginia.
In Virginia, at, can't remember, camp, I'd drawn a blank. But anyway, there was a camp there near, where in Virginia? It was centrally located. Then they shipped us off to a new camp about 40 miles away, and most of the people had to hike it from one to the other, and we didn't have any recruits in the organization at that particular moment, so they sent us by truck, put us in a truck and took us over, and then they had us cleaning the place up because it had never been occupied before, so washing windows and cleaning out or preparing the camp for the recruits coming in. And then, of course, when they came in, then we were involved in training them, basic training, and specifically for the medical branch of the Army. And then after a while there, I was sent off to another unit, and then ultimately assigned to the 12th, as I said, just before their leaving Camp Barkley.
So how long were you in Virginia then?
Oh, I suppose I probably was there for 18 months maybe, and then reassigned to another unit. And this thing was going on all the time anyway. So we went through basic training and all the. In fact, we received the troops off the train, and they were in civilian clothes. So it was a matter of taking them from that point and getting them in uniform, and then training them for a period of time. And so that's what I did at that point until I joined the 12th.
And what was your position there?
I was in charge of what they call the ambulance platoon of Company B, the 82nd Medical. And before the organization was caught up in this conversion from one type of the division to another type of division. And so they wound up with a bunch of men who had been part of what they call the collecting platoon. But there wasn't any collecting to do. It had to all be done with ambulances. And so we wound up using all of our men assigned to me, plus the men in the collecting platoon. So it wound up to be about 50 people that we had at our disposal to do what we had to do. And so
did you feel like that was sufficient, or?
Oh yeah,
people?
Yeah. It was more than that. In fact, we had more people than we needed, actually, because we only had 10 ambulances, and we had 2 people in each ambulance. So it was a matter of using them in different ways, the extras or what have you. Some of them got sent off to tank units or artillery units to work with the medics in those units. But for the most part, we made use of them in different capacities. Right there, either with the ambulance platoon or with the clearing platoon that we had there, whose function was to set up a place to receive the wounded and sick from the advanced units, and we were to drop them off with the clearing platoon, and they were then to decide. Doctors would look at them, decide whether they should go on back to another hospital, or sent back to their unit. So that's pretty much what we did all of the time. It was a matter of supporting specifically CCB, which consisted of the 56th Infantry and the 714th Tank Battalion. And and there was a matter of separating ourselves from the company and staying close to CCB, so we know which way they were going, so that we could send ambulances to the units to evacuate anyone that needed evacuation.
So, going back to training, you said that you did go to Camp Barkley. Do you remember how long you were there and what?
I was there 2 weeks. They'd already been trained, and they were prepared to leave Barkley for Europe, and I just happened to be one that added to the number assigned to Company B, and so there wasn't anything dramatic or glamorous about it. It was just something that had to be done. and they needed somebody in that position. So there I was.
So you traveled a lot for a month or so.
We traveled off and on quite a bit, I would say. Yes.
By train or?
Well, I was assigned there, and I took a train for Camp Barkley, and when I got there, I got off, and of course they took me in tow after that. But we left by troop train from Barkley, and we went up to New Jersey, and from there we got on a boat and crossed over.
What was that like? Do you remember what the name of the boat was?
Well, I was not particularly well suited for water travel, so I spent a fair amount of my time in bed. First of all, in my own bed, and then finally they put me down in the hospital area, and they didn't do much for me. It was just a matter of letting me lay down and not move until we got to England, of course. Then I quickly recovered from that. It was just a matter of going on from there. Even crossing over from England to France was not particularly glamorous or even dramatic, because when we get on a LST, of course a lot of our equipment and vehicles were on it. But we got on there, and they invited us down to eat. And of course, when we came in, we saw the ship's crew eating well, steaks and whatnot, and they opened sea ration cans for us. They didn't even open them. They served them to us hot. And so we got to eat sea rations in the adjoining room, but it was at a table, so I guess we could be grateful until we got to France, and then of course we unloaded there. And the interesting thing was that at one point, because I spoke French, I'd grown up speaking French and going to French and English schools. They called upon somebody to come to the bridge to speak with the French pilot who was going to steer it up the Seine River, and so I went in there. But he didn't want to talk to anybody. He knew exactly what he had to do, and he went about doing it. So I just sort of stood up there and watched from the bridge rather than being down in a hole somewhere.
So where did you land in France?
That's a very good question.
Not sure.
Well, we went up the Seine River and offloaded and stayed there briefly until all the equipment was unloaded, and then it was a matter of moving on out from there. So it was just a wide spot in the road. It was actually called, it's all coming back, I haven't processed this for some time now, a place called Luneville, Luneville. And so we stayed there for a short time, and we had to put up wherever we could, so an awful lot of us were in barns. At least there was hay on the ground, on the surface, and so that wasn't so bad. But it wasn't exactly the Ritz, you would say. And so we left from there and moved into duty, and then we were assigned to CCB, and after that it was mostly a matter of just following them and doing supporting them in whatever way we needed to.
What time of the year was it?
That was in the fall, just before cold weather.
In 1942 then?
43, yeah. And because we were engaged mostly in 44.
So what exactly was your responsibilities when over in?
My specific responsibility all the time that we were in Europe was to provide ambulance service from the combat units that were in front of us, the 714th and the 56th, and also the 494th. But the 494th, since it was an artillery unit, they were not necessarily in the front lines, but the 714th and 56th were. So it was a matter of remaining in contact with them to evacuate the wounded or the sick from their hands and getting them back to get whatever was needed for them.
So were you based with the aid station?
No, actually we weren't. We were totally separate, and we usually tried to stay close to CCB headquarters because they had all the information to which direction the 56th and the 714th were going in. And then it was a matter of just simply, what we did was to actually assign 2 ambulances to each of the units and hold the others in reserve. And so when an ambulance came back with wounded or what have you, they would come by our place, and we would switch the assistant driver in each of the ambulances, and the new ambulance would then go forward to where they had been. And so we always had contact with them. Sometimes they would move, and it would be a little difficult to catch up with them. But the ambulances, on the whole, the people in the ambulance did a fine job. Made it much easier for me. But we stayed pretty much away from our company in that function. It was only when the division was in a rest area that we wound up with the company. But for most of the time, when we were in combat, we were away from them because they had a different function. The rest, they had a clearing platoon, and their function was to receive the injured and the sick and do what they could for them, keep them there or evacuate them, or when they were ready, go back if they were in shape to go back.
So how close were you to the front line at any given time?
Sometimes, for the most part, we were back. CCB headquarters, often enough we were very close to wherever they were located because they had the information of where these units were and which way they were going. And so it was a matter of just keeping in contact. A few times we would get out on roads when I would go out to visit either the 56th or the 714th to just touch base with them, see if they were okay and whether they needed anything. And once in a while we would wind up on a road where there wasn't anybody. And sometimes there were Germans there. So it was a matter of trying to keep as well informed as possible, and CCB, of course, was supposed to have the information for us. And for the most part, they did. Once in a while, there were things happening that we really didn't expect to find.
Do you remember an event in that situation?
Oh,
You can
yes.
explain.
Yes, I remember we were in a Jeep, and I had an assistant, the second lieutenant, and we were on this road looking for one of the aid stations, and we suddenly were being shot at in the ambulance, and I mean in the Jeep, and the lieutenant was actually killed. He received a shot in the neck and never survived, never recovered. But it was a matter of our going on, getting away from wherever we were, and got to an aid station, and then found a better way to get back to our unit. So that was our function, was to maintain contact with those advanced units, and for the most part we were always safely behind the line somewhere. But sometimes with a armored division, one did not always know. And sometimes it was a matter of just going until you found somebody.
How much medical training did you receive? Were you just strictly
I was
up and go, or did
I was not a doctor. I was what they call medical. I have to try to remember the old name because they then changed it. It was Medical Administrative Corps, and our function was to provide support to the doctors or the medics, and so we wound up doing an awful lot of things. At that time, there was always a medical officer, a doctor, in charge of every medical unit, but they subsequently changed that so that we were able to serve as commanding officers of units. And if it was a hospital, it would be a different matter, but a field unit, there was no reason to have a doctor in charge. And so, but at that time, they had plenty of doctors that they got from one place or another, and so they got to serve. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's about all I know. Unless you've got a question that's going to provoke me.
What do you remember? What was like a common injury? What was like the most common injury, or?
No, there was everything under the sun, and it would frequently depend on the unit, because if it was an infantry unit, then it could be a wound anywhere. But if it was a tank unit, it was a totally different matter, and there was many a time when none of them got out of tanks. They died in there and stayed there. But if if we had people to remove from, they had leg and arms and head wounds of all kinds. So we just had to be prepared to take whatever they had and to move them back as quickly as possible, because it was terribly important that anyone who was injured or anyone who was sick, that he received treatment as soon as possible. And that was really the clue. That's really the answer to saving people, because the important thing was not to just simply remove them from their unit, but to get them in shape to go back to their unit as soon as possible. Because otherwise that meant the man was lost to the unit, and then they had to wait for replacements. And sometimes that could be a pretty long time. So our function was to preserve or conserve the people as much as possible.
Do you feel like you were prepared sufficiently when you got over to the war, like emotionally? Do you remember?
Oh,
the first couple battles?
No, I don't think anyone's prepared for the first one. But it doesn't take very long for you to become accustomed, to become a veteran, so to speak. And so, because it boiled down to a few simple things. You either did or you didn't. And if you didn't, then maybe you're going to be a part of history. And so you did whatever you could to preserve yourself.
How did you control your emotions when you came up to battles where there was just a lot of injury?
Well, I suppose in our case, we had very specific things to do, and we tried not to let anything get in the way of it, because if these people were at an aid station, something had to be done with them. They couldn't continue to carry them with them, so it was a matter of removing them just as quickly as possible. And that's why we used to put 2 ambulances at each battalion, so that they were always one there, because they could load up to 4 at a time if need be, if they were on a litter. If there were more than that walking wounded, why you could put more than that in the ambulance. But for the most part, it was a matter. And then, of course, we were so located that we weren't that far from the aid station, so that we always had an ambulance moving forward to replace the one that was on its way back with either sick or wounded. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you get involved with this company? Did you offer to get into this when you signed up, or?
Oh, I volunteered back in '42 to go to cavalry, because I had, romantic notions about serving in that capacity. And somebody in their wisdom decided that probably what I needed to do was something else. And so they decided that I need to go into the medical service. And I was assigned to the camp and went there and went through basic training, and then became a corporal, and I started training myself, training others, I mean. And so it was a matter of becoming involved and realizing that you were doing something that had some value to it. So that when you're young, you frequently become very flexible. And sometimes you don't even have a choice in the matter.
Did you have a choice in this situation, or were you
I just sort of accepted, I think, after I went in, and they didn't even say anything about the cavalry. But as you can see, I wound up with an armored division ultimately, but not in that capacity that I had envisioned. And so it was, I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed doing that. In fact, when I got out of the service in '45, I decided to go back to school, continue my schooling, and then the activities in Korea came up, and they decided that I should serve again. So I went back in and served. In fact, I decided to stay in after that and make it a career. And I did until I had a heart attack and hospitalized and put out to pasture.
So you did retire in the service?
Yes, I retired from the service on a medical disability, and at 35. And I went into, got some more training and went into teaching at college in North Carolina.
Well, going back to the actual
Right,
war.
to the war.
Do you, how involved were you with the Battle of Pearlshine? Do you recall that?
I'd say we were pretty well involved in it because we, at that point, we had a location across the street from CCB headquarters. And so it was a matter of just going across and finding out whatever information you needed to where the units were and how things were going. We were close enough to then be able to support the 3 units we were supposed to support. And it got pretty hairy there when they suddenly realized that 1 unit was gone completely. But our function was to support our units, and that's all there was to it. It wasn't any more complicated than that.
How, do you remember getting any sleep during that time? I mean,
Oh, yeah, we would get sleep, and sometimes we might get a whole night's sleep. And it was a matter of opening up C rations like anybody else, or later on K rations. So it was pretty much perfunctory. It was something that we had to do, and that was to keep the ambulances moving forward when needed. It was really a very simple process. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't glorious, it was just something that had to be done. Because those people had to be, if they were wounded or if they were sick, they had to be moved back. And in Herlesheim, I can remember when we used to bring people from the infantry or from the tanks unit, and things were desperate enough that they would not let us evacuate anyone unless they were very seriously injured. They were in turn put in a barn and sort of kept comfortable and treated with whatever they needed treating. The most common thing there was difficulty with cold and feet in particular. And frostbite was a very common condition. And so it was a matter of putting them on reserve, so to speak, right there in Herlesheim, rather than evacuating them back, because there wasn't a ready supply of replacements available to take their place. And the command simply didn't know but what they were going to have to make use of them. And they were just put in a comfortable place and fed and comforted, and if need be, and many of them wanted to get back. I'd say most of them who were taken back from units wanted to rejoin their units, no matter where they were. So that was very comforting to realize that these men felt that way about it.
Do you remember some friends that you came in contact with during that time?
Well, yes, of course, I mentioned Wesley Gardner. Then we had several others, and unfortunately, a whole lot of them are already gone. And I sort of feel like I'm an extra anymore, considering the number who've already died, and a lot of them have died from early on, from 45 on, and so as a matter of fact, it was just last year, if I remember correctly. Somebody from the Armored Division had heard about or knew of a doctor in Kokomo, Indiana, and it turns out to be he was a medical officer, a doctor who served in the unit, and I got to know him fairly well, and then he left to come back to the States, and I left and went in different directions. We were never in contact after that until unfortunately it was at his death that I got information of that fact.
What was his name?
Now you got me. I'm going to have to actually look at stuff because I don't remember names too well.
That's fine.
But anyway, he, oh yeah, his name was Max Earl, E-A-R-L. And he served a long time as a physician in Kokomo. And a little later on, I found out he had two sons who were both in medicine. And they wanted to know if we had any pictures of their father at that time. And I went through an album and found one picture in particular and had copies made and sent to them. So, so that's one little thing that happened. Then I remember some who had served in the unit who were in Texas, and I remember at one time talking with them and arranged for some information from them, and so they were very, very helpful at that time. But the ones I very clearly remember are people like Max Earl and Wes Gardner in my own unit. And, so we were very, very close for a long, long time.
What was the end of the war like for you?
The end of the war. Well, of course, it was great relief that no one was shooting. Because even though we were in the medics, we know that some of the medics were being shot. And so it was, I suppose, a relief that it was over, but an anxiety to get back to the United States and to pick up your life again and to go on. And of course there it was a matter of, I had finished high school and didn't see anything, didn't know anything else, and until I came back and decided that I wanted to go to college. And went in Springfield, and actually was doing all right until they said, "Hey, we need you again." And it was at that point when I went in for Korea and wound up doing some of the same thing that I had done in World War II, except that I was doing it with jeeps, litter jeeps, instead of ambulances, because we didn't have any ambulances in that unit that I was assigned to. And it was a matter of using those to evacuate the wounded, just as we had done before. So by that time, it was old stuff.
With new equipment.
Hmm?
With newer equipment.
Newer equipment, but it was not nearly as comfortable as having ambulances, because litter jeeps, they were racks mounted on the jeep where you could haul off 2 people at a time, and they were exposed to all the elements. So it wasn't particularly glamorous, but it was just something that had to be done. And so this was a paratrooper unit, and I was assigned to the 11th Airborne at Camp Campbell, of all things. So we had to create an ambulance and a clearing platoon from what we had available, and get them equipped and trained and packed up and sent off. So, and that's where I met some other wonderful people, and who are still around, still friends.
Did you, when the war ended, did you have sufficient points, or did you have to continue? Did you have to stay over? Or did you?
No, when I came back to the United States, I was sent on home, because everything had come to a screeching halt by the time I got back, and so it was a matter of sending them home.
So, did you? What were your parents like, or your father rather? Was your father really happy for you to be home, or?
I suppose so. One did not always know for sure, because he had his life and went his way, and I went my way. Yeah. Did
you have any relatives or girlfriends or anything that wrote you during the war?
Well, I had a girlfriend from hometown, but that didn't last very long after I left. So there wasn't much to say there. Relatives, they, for the most part, were older, and of course they weren't called upon to serve, and so they stuck around. My father was in a shop manufacturing things for the war effort, and so he continued on. Of course, he was too old by that time to be called up to service, and so myself and my brother, the second one, we were old enough to serve, and he wound up being in a totally different organization, and while we were waiting to be brought back to the States, he came and visited me, and spent 2 or 3 days. So that was a delightful change.
What was his name?
Roland. And he served he actually served at D-Day landing. He was with the engineering outfit, and he had become pretty much of an expert, so he wound up being a sharpshooter, and his function was to shoot He didn't have to do any engineering work. So he made it fine through the whole thing, and we rejoined after the cessation of hostilities, and had a few days together until he got sent back to the States, and then ultimately I did.
So did you have any leave times? Were you able to?
Oh, I had plenty of leave time accumulated. So I got paid instead of taking leave. I had some interesting, I guess one particular interesting point there when we were in Germany and waiting around, and so I wound up getting a 3-day pass to go to France, and so it was a great time. We sort of forgot everything, just enjoyed ourselves.
We is
All those who wound up in that town, because it was a place that they had set up to let people come back and rest and enjoy themselves. And so that's what it was. We encountered people who didn't know it all, but it didn't matter after a drink or two.
what did you have any involvement with the civilians?
Not really much at all. No, I'd say for the most part, after the war, we were housed in civilian facilities, that is, homes, and so we got to know them very briefly for the short time we were there, and no, I really didn't know anyone that I wanted to remember.
So you returned to the States, and did you start college then, or did you know what you wanted to do? Or?
Yes, I started. I got back in April, and I started in fall going to school. And then, of course, this was cut short by another invitation to go to Korea. And when I returned, I was able. I was assigned in one place. I was assigned at Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, and wound up coordinating medical service in the Washington, D.C. area, because our headquarters had that as a function, and so it was a matter of coordinating medical service with the Air Force and with the Navy in the Washington area.
Was that after the Korean War?
This was after the Korean War. Yeah.
So you didn't graduate from college then?
Not then. It was only while I was stationed in Washington that I went back to school, the University of Maryland, and finished my degree.
And what did you study? What did you study?
Well, I had a degree in military science, if that means anything. But it was just very general subjects for the most part, except for some specialties. And in fact, I was scheduled to be reassigned at the end of the third year, and I was still finishing up school, and they let me stay another year so that I could finish up. And, so that's about it.
Did you marry?
Yes, married, had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, and one of them is out near San Francisco, has his own business out there, and one of them lives not too far from where we are, in Flat Rock, North Carolina, where there's a theater. She got interested in theater, and she's been with them for 5-6 years now. And I have another son who recently left Colorado, and for the moment he's at Flat Rock doing some work there, and when the theater season is over, he's heading back, or not back, he's going down to Florida. He doesn't really know what he wants to do. So that's
Okay.
it.
I think I have them. Do you have any questions?
I have one question. We never mentioned Pearl Harbor.
Um,
What kind of effect did Pearl Harbor have on you?
Oh, Pearl Harbor. I can remember being out on the street in West Springfield, Mass, when we heard the news, on the radio, of course, that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And a lot of us swarmed around for a while, and it was as a result of that I volunteered for the service, thinking just as soon as I turned 18 in January, why, I was ready to go. But I had to wait until April before Father signed all the papers and they called me. So it was rather a momentous time, because we were wandering up and down the street. What in the world's going to happen? What are we going to do? And realized that some of us had to become involved. And so that's about it.
What do you remember doing on it the day when the war ended? Like, what do you remember specifically doing? Like, where were you? What are some people that you see? What are images?
When the war ended,
Uh-huh. The day when the war is over. When you guys hear about it.
well, I guess probably I was still in Germany at the time, because some of us were going to be returned to the United States and then sent off in the other direction. But fortunately, it concluded before I was sent back from Germany. So it was just a matter of then going home and getting home as quickly as you could. And I wound up being transferred from the 12th Armored Division to a unit up at Bremerhaven, Germany. And all they were doing is accumulating people until they had the right number, and they put us on a boat and sent us back. So that was a glorious moment.
What impact has the 12th Armored Division Association had on you?
It's I think I joined the 12th Armored Association principally because of Wes Gardner. Wes Gardner was very active in the unit. He was in Long Island, and he contacted me, and he didn't force me. He couldn't force people to do anything, but I thought it would be a nice thing to do, and So joined, and I served. I went to the meetings until by that time I was back in the Army and sent off to either Germany or someplace else, and so it was a matter of not being able to continue on. But then later on, getting hooked up again with Wes and 12th. Yeah. And so I've gotten to know an awful lot of the people here now, and some of the ones that we remember very well are no longer with us. And Wes Gardner just died about 2 months ago. And so that was quite an event for me anyway. Because he was really, he wasn't a father, but he was old. There was sufficient gap in years, 20 years, that he easily could have been. And so we always had an excellent time together, going fishing and one thing or another. So enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, sir. I think we have it all.
Yep.
It's over?